Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kendra Yock.
And I'm Amy Dickerson.
Welcome to the second webinar in our Franczek Educational Equity Series. Amy and I will be your moderators for this monthly series that will run throughout the year. During the series, we're exploring how school districts can identify and break down systemic barriers that are depriving our Black and Brown students of equitable educational opportunities, how to more intentionally allocate resources based on need, and use the law as a driver for internal reforms to support our most vulnerable student populations. These conversations may not always be comfortable, but they're critical to making meaningful and positive changes in our public school systems. Today, we're pleased to have with us Teresa Lance, Assistant Superintendent of Equity and Innovation at School District U46. Good afternoon. And Adrian Harries, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Community Unit School District 300. Welcome to you both. Also joining us is our partner and regular webinar presenter, Jackie Werns. Good afternoon. Before we begin, I want to address a couple of general logistics. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. It is easier for us to keep track of those in the Q&A than in the chat function. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact any of us. Our next webinar in the equity series will be March 11th. We will be discussing recruiting, hiring, and retaining a diverse group of teachers and administrators. We also have our webinar next Thursday, where the panel will be discussing labor and employment updates from Biden's first 30 days. So please join us for those. We'll go ahead and get started. For just some general background, can we talk just a little bit about the districts that you guys are working in? Teresa, do you want to start talking a little bit about U46?
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. And Franczek, thank you for inviting me to be a part of the webinar. I certainly appreciate it. So I'm here in Elgin, Illinois, District U46. We are pre-K through 12, and we have a little over 37,000 students in our district. And the student population is fairly diverse with 56% of our students Latinx, 26% white, we have 6% African-American, and 2% an Asian population. On the flip side, our staffing demographics are not so diverse. So keeping in line with many of our public schools across the nation, we have a large white population of teachers. So more than 70% of our teaching force are white. And then our African-American and Asian staff members comprise less than 2%. And then we've got a little over 20% of our staff members that are Latinx. We have 15% of our students are students with disabilities. I am proud to say that we're a dual language district. So more than 11,000 of our students from pre-K through high school are enrolled in a dual language program. And I'll say more than 60% of our students qualify for free and or reduced meals. You heard me say we got 37,000 students and they come from over 11 different communities. So that's just a little bit about U46.
Thanks, that's really helpful background information to have. And I'm glad you called out sort of the difference between your student population and your teaching population. And we can talk kind of as we go through about the impact that has and where we want to go with that. Adrian, can you tell us a little bit about your district?
We actually, and thank you, Franczek, for hosting. I'm sorry, let me back up. Adrian Harries, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in D300. And of course, my phone would ring right now. We are actually in a neighboring school district next to Elgin. Not as large, and sorry about the ringing, not as large, but almost as large as U46 with over 20,000 students. Our demographics, we are predominantly white as a district, but we're also a low income district. 42% of our students below the, low are considered to be low income. One of the things that is unique about us is that we have 27 schools, but we actually cover like 3 very different distinct communities. We've got some of our schools that are kind of fit more of a rural demographic. We've got a number of our schools that would fit what we consider to be kind of a suburban demographic. And we also have an urban kind of community. And so that makes the work that we do to try to accommodate the needs of all of these different populations very, very interesting. Similar to U46, most of our teaching demographic is white. I believe we're in about the 80% of our staff being white, very few staff of color. And it does create interesting dynamics in regards to how we best serve our students of color. So it's a little bit about U46. I'm sorry, not U46, District 300. I'm thinking about Dr. Lance. Apologies.
Well, thank you, Mr. Harries and Dr. Lance, for giving us the background regarding your districts. Before we dive into more of the work that you're doing at your districts, could you give us some information about your individual backgrounds and each of your professional paths that led you to the role that you're in now? And maybe Mr. Harries, if you want to start.
This is oh my goodness, 25 years in education. Started out as a teacher. Spent 7 years as a teacher in the Waukegan School District. And this is year 17, 18 in that boat of me being an administrator. My first year as a district administrator. Typically, I've worked as a principal at the building level. Worked in some wonderful communities. Used to be a principal out in Joliet, Maywood. Also spent time in Evanston as a principal, which is my hometown. And then I got an offer to come out here from Dr. Hyde, our superintendent, to do work that I was really passionate about, that I've been longing to do for a long time. And it just seemed like the perfect fit. So a little bit about me.
Dr. Lance?
Sure. So I'm originally from New York, so born and raised in a little city outside of the Bronx. But I've been in education come August, I think 28 years. So exciting times. I started my career similar to Adrian, just a traditional career path as a teacher in Baltimore City schools. I taught health and physical education to middle schoolers, and then gradually just climbed the ladder like most folks in central office, assistant principal. I worked in several school districts. I was in Colorado Springs as an assistant superintendent, or school leadership officer was the title, but comparable to school leadership officer, assistant superintendent. Left there, was a superintendent in a neighboring district, District 215, did that for a couple of years. And now I am assistant superintendent of equity and innovation. And what really drove me to this work is the ability to explicitly work on eradicating inequities within the system. As a superintendent, your job covers a mammoth of tasks. And so although you may want to focus on equity, the work of superintendency really takes you outside of that. So I'm able to truly focus on the work of equity, among some other things, but this work really allows me to do that.
Great. And let's dive in a little bit more to what this role entails. Can you tell us kind of what's the scope of this role, and then how does it fit in to the bigger administration within the district, and kind of how do you fit in with the other pieces? Dr. Lance, you want to start?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, especially that idea about fitting in, because I think about the role of an equity officer and not being placed in a container. And what I mean by that is individuals who typically have the role of an equity officer, DEI, or whatever title you want to call it, oftentimes you'll see that they're placed in this container and they're only called when it's crisis. And I think that's the wrong approach. So in my particular role, all of my colleagues know that I'm going to be interfacing with them and members of their department. So that means I report directly to our deputy superintendent and superintendent. I sit on their cabinet. That means I'm going to have my hands immersed in curriculum, teaching and learning. I'm going to be meeting with our district attorneys to review policies. I'm going to be meeting with our school resource coordinator to talk about discipline and the disproportionality, special education, our dual language. So my role is not one that can be contained. I don't think any DEI officer's role can be contained in one particular bucket. You can expect, and you should expect, to be interfacing with multiple departments across the district.
Mr. Harries, what about you?
Dr. Lance said a ton. To me, there is no place where we couldn't work to be more equitable to support kids. And so that does put us in long-term a lot of different departments. To me, some of the, this being year one in my case, some of the biggies that to me I'm looking to address are things like hiring. As you know, both Dr. Lance and I pointed out, to me, you have to start with coming up with a more balance so that your students are seeing teachers of color, administrators of color. And unfortunately, I know in our district that's been a goal. We just haven't been able to get there. To me, the second area is professional development, because we're looking at smaller departments that wind up having their hands in a lot of different buckets and work. To me, one of the best approaches is really to kind of lift the whole in terms of understanding equity. And so to me, if we do a really good job of providing professional development, and that's where I've been trying to focus my time, then slowly but surely everything becomes more equitable as we try to be in all of these different departments as best as possible. And then to me, the last key area is curriculum. You could have, students and staff that look like one another, but if the curriculum doesn't reflect the students that are sitting in front of it, then ultimately kids aren't seeing themselves in things like history and in things like math and in things like ELA. So those are the three main, but to Dr. Lance's point, there is no place within the educational realm that couldn't benefit from our assistance. So.
Yeah, I love that idea. Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Godefroy-Warrens from Franczek. I love the comment that, you shouldn't just be called in a crisis, because as an attorney who focuses a lot of my work on civil rights and equity issues, that's actually a transition that I think we've seen too, is that it used to be that we were really only called like if there was a big lawsuit or if there was a crisis that needed to be, a fire that needed to be put out. But we're starting to see much more of like a partnership where, people are calling, as you said, Dr. Lance, when they're doing policy reviews to say, what equity issues should we be thinking about? What legal issues should we think about here? And such a good point, especially for maybe for folks who are on the webinar today who are from smaller districts where maybe they're being put a little bit more in the in that hole. And I don't know if either of you have any suggestions or thoughts, insights for someone who might be in that situation about how to kind of get into a more proactive role.
Actually, to me, that if I was in a smaller district, to me, my time, my energy, my emphasis would really be placed on that professional development tier, just because, and that's actually one of the hardest, being in a bigger district to kind of get at and access. To me, PD is best done when you can do things like be in breakout, especially if I think about the current landscape, when you can do things like breakout groups and they're manageable. Right now, PD, because this is a larger district, it has to be on a big scale. And so it's not always as personal as you would like it to be. And so to me, when you're in a smaller space, it does afford you those things. And to me, you can move at a quicker pace in terms of educating as many people as possible. Because once again, it does require more than a team of one. And the quicker you can help cultivate some of that, the more people you have to assist.
So I know Adrian talked quite a bit about the professional development. What I know as a country is that we spend billions of dollars on professional development every year, whether it's through title dollars or local dollars. And what we also know is that we're not seeing return on investment on that professional development. So from my lens, it's really about working with leadership from top down, because if we're engaging in professional development, then it has to be some concerted and deliberate effort on monitoring and supporting implementation of the professional development. In terms of being proactive, I think equity in and of itself has to be a part of every single conversation. So at the board level, at the cabinet level, it has to be the driving force of everything. So I think about districts that may have a small in size of African-American, Latinx, or just students of color, even small in size. That does not mean that you neglect that population. What that means is it's even more important that you elevate the diversity in your district, whether through hiring practices, getting to know those students by name, getting to know their families, understanding their cultural and linguistic needs. So really being proactive, because we also know that there's a lot of research that says that white students and staff members benefit from a diverse student population as well as staff. So really putting equity at the forefront of everything that you do. It really should be sitting on every single agenda across the district. But again, I think you also have to focus on leadership. I'm going to always say leadership matters.
Thank you so much for that. And as we think about starting, for both of you, you're relatively new in these roles. And so thinking about the best approach to take to address these issues in the way that you've described, we also hear, as we're getting into a new presidential administration, a lot of talk about what things can be done in the first 100 days. So, as you've gotten started, what have you thought about in terms of identifying and tackling the priorities, especially those that you've just discussed, for your first 100 days? Mr. Harries?
Yeah, I was trying to find my unmute. For me, to piggyback off of what Dr. Lance was just saying, it really has been learning. Trying to learn more, because this was a new community for me. And so you can learn so much from school report card data and looking at data, but you really have to get out and about and learn about the area that you're serving. And so unfortunately, the pandemic has made that an interesting process, but I'm still in the process of trying to learn more. Once again, 27 schools, different types of community. I've got to get into the community and learn kind of what has been the past practice, what has been going on, and if we're honest, what possibly is not working about some of the past practices before we can just come and overhaul. I think one of the biggest errors we make is we try to do one general overhaul of a system, and especially in a district like this, where we are talking about different communities. And so that's just really what my first 100 days has been. I'm still in that learning phase. So we build as we learn.
Well, these 100 days, it seems like it's been 100 years because of the pandemic, but it went fast. So we have 57 schools here in the district. And I knew upon my hire that there were folks who were going to be pulling me in multiple directions. And so I'm a department of one, and I'll talk about that later, I would imagine. But basically, what I wanted to do was to identify what patterns existed in our district. So I started informally interviewing members of the superintendent's cabinet, including the superintendent, our union president, and then members of our administrative staff. And I asked them the same three questions. Number one, what are the strengths of our district? Number two, what are opportunities for our district? And then three, from where they sit, from their lens, what do they believe was the greatest inequity in our district? So I asked everyone that question with the hope that there would be some pattern, some theme that emerged and that would drive my work. Unfortunately, that was not the case. So my first 100 days consisted of still gathering that information, I also, because our professional development calendar was set, I knew that I needed to actually get into school. So I just put together a professional development calendar, a menu of options. And I sent that out to schools and I said, here's what I can deliver. Please talk to your school improvement team and let me know how I can be of support. So I've been doing professional development. I launched a new call to committee. There were 25 members on an equity committee before I arrived. And I knew that with over 3,000 staff members in our district, we could have a more robust committee. So I launched another call, So right now we have over 70 members that serve on that equity committee. So we're in the process of revising the existing equity plan so that we can have more robust metrics that we can both monitor and ensure that they are high performance and high impact. So what are those high leverage things that we can begin to do to eradicate inequities for our children and our staff? I spend a lot of time on staff because we have less than 2% of our staff members are African American. So I also launched Affinity Groups. So again, I was hearing overwhelmingly from many of my colleagues that our staff of color need a place. They were feeling as though they didn't belong. So I launched several affinity groups, our African American Affinity Group, Asian Affinity Group, LGBTQ, Latinx, and then our White Allyship Affinity Group, which is actually our largest affinity group as of today. So those are some of the things that I did, but the last thing I just did this was I also launched an RFP, so this request for proposal, with the hope of identifying a vendor to conduct an equity audit in our district. So having someone come out, peel back the layers and tell us, what are we doing well? What should you be doing, with some recommendations and some technical support as we begin to engage in the work. So that was my 100 days.
So many good things in there from both of you. Thank you. Jackie, do you want to speak a little bit to audits? I'm so glad that you've raised that. That's something that we've been kind of talking and thinking about a lot too. And I know, Jackie, you have some experience with that kind of more from the legal side too.
Right. So when we think about equity audits, there are different angles you can obviously come at an audit from. There is the angle of sort of a more pedagogical or curriculum focused approach. There's also from a legal perspective, equity audits that are done. So I can talk a little bit about what the legal audit looks like if you were just ever to decide to go that route. And there are pluses and minuses, positives and negatives. I actually think that the best audit takes into consideration both legal and non-legal issues. But so on the legal side, what we're often doing when we come in to do an audit in a school district, it looks a little bit like what I did when I worked at the Department of Education at the Office for Civil Rights as a civil rights investigator. So you come into the school or the school district and you sort of, you look under the hood, you see, you look at things like the numbers of students who are disciplined and for what, for example, to determine whether or not there are any disparities. You look at the systems that are in place for complaints to be made. You look at policies and procedures. All of these are things that you would have to do if you had an OCR complaint and you were found to have violated a law that prohibits discrimination or harassment based on race, color, national origin, gender, disability. But the benefit is that you're doing it first. You're doing it proactively. And the benefits to that are so many. One of them is that you can do it in a legally privileged manner, where the purpose of the audit is for an attorney like myself to give advice, to give legal advice to the school board on how to make changes, as opposed to doing it in a way that is public, where where the scrutiny might lead to challenges with implementing change, right? But the other positive to it is that for any of you who have ever had the misfortune of being on the receiving end of an OCR complaint, and specifically one where you lost, you know that OCR monitoring can be very, very lengthy. It also can often be a precursor to litigation. So a lot of times people will file an OCR complaint and then after that they'll file a lawsuit, and lawsuits make OCR complaints look like a cakewalk. So the idea of doing an audit yourself from the legal perspective, instead of waiting for someone to raise a complaint, is that you can address any issues without having to go through that lengthy process of either monitoring or a lawsuit, or God forbid, you have a lawsuit that ends up in a consent decree where you've got a court, involved for a long time. So the idea here is just to try to cut that off at the pass by doing this work. And yeah, it's hard work. It's complicated work. And I know on the education side, on the pedagogical side, it is as well. and also professional development coaching in addition to pedagogy. You know, the auditing of that type of stuff is very different from the legal side. But all of these types of audits, the overarching goal is that proactive approach that Dr. Lance and Mr. Harries mentioned earlier, where you're trying to get at it before there's a problem.
If I can jump in there,
yeah,
we're in the process of, we just completed our RFP for that similar work. It also frames the work. Oftentimes in that learning process, in both of our cases, I mean, in rather large districts, it's hard to accumulate enough information to figure out where is your next best step, if that makes sense. And the audit, especially from the instructional side, the pedagogical side, and I definitely think the legal side is definitely necessary as well. But from the pedagogical side, it should really guide what our first or next steps are in terms of things we have to tackle. So that's one of the things that we as a collective, as we try to build a foundation for what this work looks like for future DEIs, that's one of the places where we've been focusing.
Great. And thinking along those proactive lines, we did get a really good question during registration. Our listener states, one of the greatest challenges for equity workers is actually identifying policies that are at the source of inequity, whether they're causes or byproducts of structural inequity, discrimination, or oppression. What's your process for identifying these potential policy changes before you start mobilizing? How do you get to this more proactive method? And so I think it sounds like both of you guys are using the audit in that way to identify some of the places where you need to take action. Do you guys have other thoughts about how you're proactively figuring out, you know, especially with respect to policies, which ones are having, you know, potentially negative impact on students of color? I don't know if somebody wants to jump in.
I don't mind. Mr. Harries, you want to take it?
Yeah, I don't mind. To me, one of the places that I've just been looking through is because oftentimes you see that show up in a great deal in discipline policies. And so I know we haven't fully started our revamp of discipline for what it's going to look like next year, mindful of the fact that we're just now really integrating our students back into an in-person or hybrid model. But to me, that's one of the places where we've had some discourse around the fact that we've got to make some changes because some of our policies, and they're just outdated in terms of some of the things that we're looking for and asking for in regards to our students and their conduct, and they need to be revised. And so to me, that was a great starting point just to start looking at some key policies. So that's where we started.
Yeah, I made that a part of my first 100 days as well, digging into policy. And we have the benefit of having several attorneys on site. So I also met with the attorneys as well to get an understanding as to how policies are reviewed, what's the cycle, who's involved in that process. I didn't see anything glaring that said to me or spoke to me that inherently embedded in these policies are obstacles. There was nothing glaring. So it was really kudos to the Board of Education, the attorneys and cabinet members before me that really took the time to sort of revise policies and even create an equity policy that was really specific on how they were going to eradicate inequities and make sure that there were opportunities available for students. So I really, I did that. And then also I spent considerable more time on the instructional policy because I was really interested in seeing why was the data the way it was? So is there something embedded in the curriculum piece? For example, the graduation requirements. Are we requiring students to engage in X, pick X? So let's say it's physics, and our students are unsuccessful in physics because we haven't intentionally put prerequisites in place, or we've made prerequisites barriers. So I was really intentional with looking at the instructional policy after I had a true understanding of what is our process. So I know here in U46, we're on a 2-year cycle. So every 2 years, we're looking at all policies. But then as mandates come, and we know, I think it was last year, there was like 100 policies that came through on the education side. So this legal department, they are responsible for making sure that whenever these mandates come down, that we are addressing them right away. But that's really how I approach that policy piece.
Yeah, if I can say too on this policy and procedures, again, from the OCR perspective. So think about more than just your policies as well, because so for example, let's say you had a complaint that there was racial discrimination in a basketball program at your school district or at your school. When we would come in to investigate, we would look at the board policy, absolutely. But we would also ask for pretty much any other documents that are given out to team members. So for example, the student handbook, the athletic code of conduct, even sometimes sheets that people sign to, before they go into the tryout process. We would want to look at all of that. And typically when we would find a problem, when we would find one of those glaring things, it would be in those more, particularly at building level documents that were being put out, or where there just weren't, again, most of the time not inadvertent, but people just not thinking about what the impact was of a particular rule. So I would think really broadly when you're doing these reviews, especially if you're lucky enough to be in a district that has like, we're going to do this every 2 years, maybe on the off year, you're also doing a review of all the other paperwork that really, when it comes down to it, most parents and students, even some employees, they don't even know where to find your policy handbook. So they are really relying on those procedural documents.
That's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let's transition and talk a little bit about something else that is top of mind, and a reason that we certainly get a lot of calls to us as lawyers, questions about teacher speech, especially related to Black Lives Matter, what people have posted in their Zoom background, those types of questions we find coming across our desk a lot. And so I wanted to bring Jackie in to talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you all that I'm going to give you the short spiel on this, but please remember that as part of our school law conference, which we did virtually last fall, we did do a session on First Amendment. They said what? First Amendment issues in 2020. And I'll put the link to that in the chat when I'm done talking. But definitely check it out, because we really delved into all of these student-teacher speech issues from an equity angle. But just to give you the short and sweet summary, we know that teachers and students, they have the right to speak in the school environment, but it is limited. It is not as robust as it would be if they were speaking out on the street corner in the town square. So in the school environment, we're typically, and again, this is a very generalized description, so go to this other webinar if you want to get the real nitty-gritty of it. But generally speaking, what we're looking at when we're looking at teacher speech is, are they speaking as a teacher, or are they speaking as a personal individual? And if they're speaking as a teacher, we have a lot more control over what their speech looks like. If they're in the classroom or on a field trip, we have a lot more control. If they're in the remote environment where they're teaching online, we get to set the curriculum. You get to set the curriculum. So you have a lot more control over what speech looks like in that environment. When we're looking at other speech that might occur by a teacher outside of the school environment on their own time, or student speech, whether it's in school or out of school, we're often looking for a disruption. Again, that's a real 30,000 foot view of it, but we're typically looking to see, is there a disruption? And if there is, we typically are able to limit it. But we also have to consider, in the circumstances where we are limiting speech, we have to do it fairly. We can't say to one person, you cannot have a Blue Lives Matter flag up in your office, but allow another person to have a Black Lives Matter flag up in their office. We typically have to be fair. The distinction, though, is that if it's the speech of the school, we don't have to be fair. Because again, you control your curriculum, you control what you're teaching. And so the thing is that we are allowed to have a lot more control there. And I do see in the comments, those aren't equivalents, Blue Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. And again, not getting into there's a lot of discussion that goes into that from a legal perspective, but generally speaking, we do expect that in the legal point of view, from the point of view of the courts, that if we were to limit speech on one, we would likely need to limit the speech on the other. However, where the lack of equivalence comes into play is that schools do have the right to say, we want to have a Black Lives Matter sign outside of our building, where we're saying to the world, this is what we believe as a community and as a school. And legally, even legally, that is something that is allowed to be done. So that's kind of and I don't know, Dr. Lance and Mr. Harries, if there are any specific questions that maybe you've come across or thought of that it might be helpful to clarify on, because again, that really is the 30,000 foot view.
And if you don't mind for me jumping in there, from the school perspective, I think one of the things that we're looking at is separating the political from the social or civil movement that is Black Lives Matter. And when you present it as, okay, this is a celebration of especially during Black History Month, and not that it should be isolated to that time, but when you help people to understand, and that's one of the things that I'm working on doing right now, that this was a civil or civic movement long before it became any form of political entity. And it actually served as a rallying cry for Black and African-American families to feel like they had an opportunity to change things that have been in existence throughout our history. When that is the celebration, which is a beautiful thing, then it doesn't take on that same onus as you being in support of the political entity that is the actual foundation. Now, that's still a hard sell. It's still hard to explain to individuals because unfortunately we're in such political times and they always want to conflate the one with the other. But that's the angle I've been trying to take as our schools go through the month and try to do more to celebrate Black Lives Matter and Black History Month. So.
Right, and that's such a great point, that one of the things that we often hear from individuals who challenge a school's speech, they challenge whether or not a school has the right to teach Black Lives Matter in the classroom, for example, to have that sign up out in front of the school. The challenge we often hear is this is political. And what we know is that generally speaking, we keep political speech out of schools. We don't allow people to come in and stump for their candidate, for example. But Black Lives Matter is not a political movement, as you mentioned. It is an ideological movement, and ideological movements are the most protected speech under the First Amendment. And so being able to make clear to your communities that distinction between political and ideological, it is a very helpful way to sort of head off some challenges.
Yeah, I'll just say, as a superintendent, I actually put Black Lives Matter on our district marquee, and then our school principals put it on their marquee and had full support of the board. So I recognize different environment and the context for which I'm working now. And so I know that we've got some teachers who, especially at the murdering of George Floyd, they had Black Lives Matter up in their windows, their office displays. And that was some of the first sort of let's talks that I was getting. What is the district's position on this? So I'm glad to hear you say, Jackie, that this is not, Black Lives Matter is not a political movement. So how do we help our communities to understand that? That is the lift. That is the lift. Because It varies from community to community.
Right. And one of, I think, the important things is to make sure that the board or the administration has taken some kind of action to communicate to the community that this is a part of our curriculum. This is a part of our social emotional learning. This is not just a teacher who is putting this up in their office of their own accord. Because again, when we get into the teacher putting it up in their office of their own accord, we start to get into these places where we have to think about the fairness. And, you know, I know that the fairness is hard because we often don't believe that these ideological movements are equivalent. But I always think back to the big case that we had in the Seventh Circuit not too long ago, which has jurisdiction over Illinois, where someone wore a t-shirt to school that said, "Be happy, not gay." And the court said, you must allow that speech because you allow speech that is pro-LGBTQ. You must allow speech that is anti, as long as it is not disruptive. And again, I personally wouldn't think those two things are anywhere close to the same, but a distinction that can be raised is if LGBTQ history, for example, is being taught in the curriculum as it now is required to be done in Illinois, that doesn't mean that the school has to also teach anti-LGBTQ curriculum, because that is the school's speech. So I think a really key point there, Dr. Lance, is having the board or the administration make it some action to make clear that this is our speech. Yes, these individual teachers are doing it, but this is our, we have our imprimatur on it.
And not to just belabor the point, just because I know it's one that we're you know, we've got some other questions to answer. But it's also just, if I think about it and make the parallel to the civil rights movement, there was a point in time where that was considered to be a political, because you were dealing with courts and trying to adjust laws. And now we look at it as a historical civil movement that to some degree attempted to change the face of our nation. And to me, Black Lives Matter, and that's one of the connections I try to help people to make. They really are extensions of one another. And so that's really the modern day era of the civil rights movement. And it's close to that as we can get, so.
Well, maybe if we talk a little bit more about curriculum, that's something that you both mentioned. We've just been talking about it. And then I know we also have some questions about your experiences more with your approaches to hiring and recruitment. So in terms of curriculum, you know, how have you each approached Black History Month and more broadly trying to incorporate diverse authors, perspectives, and ideas throughout the curriculum? Dr. Lance, do you want to share any approaches that you've been undertaking?
Sure. So I'll address the first question about the curriculum piece. I think that's why it's incumbent to do an equity audit. I did an audit in my previous district that was curriculum focused. This particular audit is an equity audit, which means we'll address curriculum, the teaching practices, we'll address policy, we'll address hiring, the HR piece, and all the quantitative data metrics that you can imagine. That was the intent of conducting an equity audit. So when I think about the curriculum piece, I think that it's critically important that our CNI department, our curriculum and instruction department, is taking the time to vet the resources that are being placed in front of our children to make sure that they are in fact culturally and linguistically rich for our children. And if we don't have the ability to do that because representation matters, in other words, you heard me say more than 70% of our staff members are white. That means more than 90% of those individuals who are working on curriculum are white. So we have to do a better job of making sure that we've got appropriate and well-trained voices that are looking at curriculum and looking at the resources. The other thing is we've got to pay attention to what's happening in the classroom. I think that's an untapped area. So we deliver professional development, we provide individuals with curriculum, and we say, go forth and teach. But no one is observing and monitoring and supporting. And I think that is wrong. The other thing is about this notion of learning loss. So I've been pushing my colleagues to define learning loss. We've been hearing learning loss since the pandemic, but what is it? What is it for U46 and every other district? Once we define what it is, then we can begin to address it as opposed to just picking up jargon because it's the next greatest phase. So that's what I think about curriculum and my role in pushing, respectfully, but pushing my colleagues to think on a larger scale, how are we addressing the needs of our students and our staff? As it relates to Black History Month, I have taken the position that that's not the role of this department. That is not the role of this department. It's the role of every single staff member in our district to make sure that Black history and every other racially diverse group is represented year round. So what I have said is I will support schools. As a matter of fact, in December, I emailed the schools and I said, please share with me your plans for Black History Month. It's like McDonald's. You can go in McDonald's, you know what's on the menu. You know Black history is coming up. So I want to know, what are your plans? And if you need support or you need help with thinking through that, I'm available. So I'm supporting schools. We got 57 schools. So it's my expectation that every single one of those schools are doing something for Black History Month. And then moving forward, we are intentional with elevating the voices of our Black folks in curriculum every day.
So to jump in there, we did make sure that I was involved in what I view more as a district-wide celebration, because it was important to me to get the district's face out in front of Black history and for our Black families to understand that they are a part of our district. As far as the school approach, my approach not that dissimilar to Dr. Lance. I did ask, what do you have going on and how can I support it? But from a district-focused perspective, knowing that one of our areas that we need to long-term improve is around culturally responsive text, not just in terms of classroom, but also within our libraries. We launched basically a large scale, also being mindful of the fact that we're in the midst of a pandemic and doing some presentations that are great in person, just don't carry the same weight over a Zoom. We launched into basically a month-long book study. And we're using, I want to say about 1,300 texts because I wanted to expose all of our families to great African-American literature. And so families were asked to actually spend the time reading around the national theme, which is, family engagement, and take images, pictures of them in the process of a collective read. We as a district are actually doing 4 read-alouds ourselves. I kicked off the month. Our superintendent is closing out the month because once again, it was important for us for families to see us engaged in celebrating Black history as a school district. And so we're reading some fantastic text. It actually gives me an opportunity. Once again, I haven't had a ton of FaceTime with all of our families, so it gives me an opportunity to at least be seen. And so, to me, it was the perfect meld of melding great Black literature with, an opportunity to do a read aloud. So as far as the curriculum angle, I got nothing to add to what Dr. Lance said. We're trying to analyze all of it. And it is trying to make sure we have culturally and linguistically responsible text in front of our kids. We are doing some overhaul of curriculum and adding curriculum because we know some of our curriculum was just a little bit outdated. And fortunately, we actually have already done that to launch into the new school year. So our students will have some opportunities to take classes that they've never had in the past. And it's an ongoing process. We will keep evolving our curriculum as we get better.
Great, and I want to turn, we've got so many good questions in our Q&A, and so I want to pull a couple of them. We have at least 2 asking for some more details on hiring and trying to get your teaching staff to be a little bit more reflective or making sure that the people that you've hired have these values. And we are going to talk about that in March, but I would love to get your perspectives. We have one question, there's a shortage of candidates. We don't have enough money to recruit them. They want to go someplace else. They're in high demand. We had another question that said, our district, we do have a smaller number of students of color and teachers of color, and people are reluctant to come kind of be the first and be one of the few. And so how do you kind of start the process of attracting more teachers of color? Do you guys have thoughts on those complicated issues?
Sure, I use this example. I worked in Colorado, and when I arrived in Colorado, it was a gentleman, he was a superintendent. He asked me to come work for him. So I did, but I'd never been to Colorado. And so I was looking at HR, and they had a ski slope on a brochure. And I said, look, If you share that with me, that's not going to get me to Colorado. I have no interest in getting on skis and going down some slope. So I think about, how do we market our school and where do we market? So working really closely with our human resources, we have not been intentional with going to HBCUs. We have 107 HBCUs. So why can we not be intentional with visiting those campuses and saying, here's what we have for you. Now, who goes? That's important too. Make sure that there's representation that looks like them to go there. In the meantime, what do you do when you have a staff that's more than 70% white? Because the goal is not to get rid of those staff members. The goal is to make sure that they are culturally proficient, so that they are culturally aware when they are in front of our children. So this is not getting rid of what you have. This is about making sure that the individuals that you do have in front of our children are well prepared to deliver instruction that is culturally relevant. So those are just some of the things that I think about when I think about recruitment and retention.
To add to that, of all years to actually make targeting HBCUs a focus, because unfortunately there are going to be a ton of open, educational open houses that are going to have to be Zoom based. And so to me, that actually has been one of the things that I've been building, is how do I get people from HBCUs to come to a District 300? What incentives do we have to present? Because that is hard. And it is, having been a Black teacher that was the first in a number of buildings, or a Black administrator that was oftentimes first in a number of buildings, if there aren't things to sell me on going to that location, why deal with the headache and struggle of being that one, and not knowing if there's going to be another one that's another person of color that's brought in that you can commune with. And so to me, that is like targeting HBCUs. So me and Dr. Lance, we might be fighting for candidates. That has to be a focus, especially with the ease in which we will have access this year. And the long-term goal is to actually continue to use forums like Zoom. It has opened up a world that we just have not explored in the past, in terms of, it was always, we have to go to this physical location to recruit teachers. And I've been on a number of those trips to try and sell a school to teachers of color specifically. But this is actually providing a ton of access that we just haven't explored in the past. And so I'm hoping to utilize that. We've got open houses actually starting within the next month. So to Dr. Lance, may the best school district win.
Well, thank you so much to each of you for sharing just some of your approaches there. I know this is going to be something, as Kendra mentioned at the beginning of the webinar today, that we're going to be diving into more deeply in our next webinar. I know another question, that we've had around just thinking about issues related to the pandemic, Dr. Lance mentioned learning loss as being a big issue and concern that we've heard over the last year. How have each of you helped, if you can share briefly, how have you had the opportunity to guide your district's plans related to remote, hybrid, in-person learning, reopening issues, and how have you worked to help ensure that those plans do have equity considerations front and center?
We've recently really been exploring that concept of how do we define learning loss without it becoming us spending the little bit of time that we now have access to our kids doing additional assessments. And while we know assessments are vital, we know they're important in terms of gauging students and where they are. When you are in a hybrid model where you've got some of your students in internal and some of them at home, that brings into question validity of assessments and things of that nature. So we've actually been trying to figure out the best way to quantify this learning loss without it being us spending the little bit of time that we have with our kids doing hardcore assessments or standardized assessments. One of the things that we are exploring is that needing to be more a process where it's a teacher, because they have a smaller group of students, having time to get to know their kid and still hitting on those key standards that kids should be developing over the course of this year, and using those to come up with individual, as best as possible, individual plans of instruction so that they can better support those kids around standards that they either didn't pick up at the tail end of last year or are missing as a result of being out this year. And so those aren't finalized. We're still in the process of developing those, but we're getting closer. So.
Thanks for sharing that, Mr. Harries. And, you know, we did get another question that Dr. Lance, maybe you can speak to with regard to kind of following up from, you know, what you touched on earlier related to the importance of professional development and your comment about monitoring and supporting teachers, particularly following that professional development. And, you know, a question we got was, how can districts ensure that they're not just providing a quick professional development session, but then, you know, not following up to ensure teachers are actually implementing those steps that were taught in the professional development and teaching the important topics with fidelity. Can you share any strategies that you might have or plan to have?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I'm wrapping up a piece for a journal on this very same topic. So I'm not a fan of drive-by professional development. And so we have to be intentional about looking at where are the gaps and where are opportunities across the organization, and then creating a professional development plan that provides a series of very similar topics, so a strand of topics throughout the course of the year. So for example, I have schools who say, can you do a training with my staff on implicit bias? And I'll say, sure, but then what next? Because it just can't be one professional development and then that's it. I'll see them next year. So my conversations with them is, okay, implicit bias, why implicit bias? And then how do we take that and continue on with professional development for your staff? So I think it's important that schools, districts that are thinking about professional development, that they actually spend time identifying the root causes for why the gaps exist, then developing a professional development plan that is a multi-year plan, which is iterative. That means as you see progress, then you can erase this and you can put something in. But don't try to do these sort of drive-bys, one and done, but really being intentional about the professional development needs of your staff, and then differentiate based on the needs of your staff. So those are the things that I think about, and I'm just about done with this journal, so stay tuned.
Great, thank you. Well, and I know that we are approaching, you know, the top of our hour here, and so, you know, we really appreciate everyone's engagement through the Q&As and these work. This is why we're doing this in a series, so that we can continue this discussion and address these issues. And we want to thank Dr. Lance and Mr. Harries so much for joining us today. We're so grateful to you both for sharing your experiences and insights with us, and appreciate your willingness that if listeners do have questions or want to discuss further how to tackle this work, that you all can reach out directly to Dr. Lance and Mr. Harries, who are happy to continue the discussion. And if we are looking forward to continuing that discussion as well here at Franczek, and if you have any legal questions or concerns, please do reach out to any of our attorneys at Franczek. And I do know we did get a question. We are recording this session. We will be making it available to everyone and emailing it out. So certainly you'll get that, and feel free to share that. As we've said, we know this work is a process, and we do want to make this an ongoing conversation. So please continue to reach out and let us know if you have questions or topics that you think we should address, or if your district is doing good work and you want to highlight that, please let us know as well. Again, you can also share this session with colleagues, and we'll be putting it not only in via email, but we'll also share it on our Education Law Insights podcast. So thank you again for being part of this effort and for the work that you're all doing to educate all of our students. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.